She was the one who poured the wine, never the one who raised the glass. She dusted the framed portraits of a family that was not her own, and all of Boston believed that the wife of crime boss Ronan Gallagher was nothing more than a maid chosen to satisfy a will quiet, obedient, harmless. So when 4 men broke into the Crown Point estate on a rainy night while the boss was away, they were certain she would fall to her knees and beg. 40 seconds later, all 4 lay motionless on the marble floor, and not one of them could explain what had just happened. What the entire East Coast underworld didn't know was that Marin Gallagher wasn't merely a contract wife. She was a ghost from a program that officially never existed, a woman erased from every database on Earth, and the deadliest secret hiding in the heart of Boston. But before he collapsed, the man who led them managed to whisper a name no one left alive was supposed to know. Her husband thought he had bought a marriage with money. He had no idea he'd just brought home the one thing money could never buy. Stay until the end, because when the truth comes out, it won't just shake a mansion, it will burn an entire criminal empire to the ground. If you love stories like this one, hit that like button to support the channel, share this video with friends who crave a gripping tale, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the stories still to come. 4 months before that fateful rainy night, in the largest room of the Crown Point mansion, crime lord Cormac Gallagher was counting the final breaths of his life. The man who had forced the entire Boston waterfront to bow before him for half a century was now nothing more than a gaunt figure swallowed by layers of heavy blankets. Yet his eyes remained as sharp as they had been in his youth, carrying the kind of gaze that could read a man before he ever had the chance to open his mouth. Beside the sickbed, the family attorney read each line of the will in a steady, measured voice, and when he reached the final provision, the entire room seemed to stop breathing. The whole Gallagher empire, from the docks stretching along the coast to the network of contractors and underground loans spread across New England, would be handed only to an heir who was married. Exactly 4 months later, the family council would convene a confirmation hearing, and that marriage had to remain intact. It had to be real, not some hastily arranged performance meant to deceive the witnesses. Ronan Gallagher stood beside the window with both hands tucked into his trouser pockets, listening to the provision as his jaw tightened. He was 33 years old, had never loved anyone long enough to remember her birthday. And now his grandfather, even while preparing to leave this world, had still found a way to bind him to one final game. News of the provision in the will spread faster than word that the old crime lord was dying. Within a single week, powerful and lesser families all along the East Coast began sending their sympathies, and attached to every expression of concern was a daughter. The Brennan family suggested their youngest daughter, who had just graduated from law school. The Cavanaghs quietly mentioned a niece who owned 3 hotels in the heart of the city. One beautiful face after another was laid upon the table like a deck of cards, and Ronan saw through every one of them, because he had grown up in this world long enough to understand one simple truth. Every bride offered to him was a knife already resting against his throat, a pair of ears planted inside his bedroom, a hand that would open the mansion gates, on the exact night the family behind her decided the Gallagher empire should belong to someone else. He rejected them all, and one evening, while sitting alone in his study, his memory suddenly drifted back to a party a few months earlier, when a guest from the council had drunk too much, caused a loud disturbance, and smashed a wineglass in the middle of the great hall, making the servants turn pale and retreat. Only one maid stepped forward. She set her tray down on the table, spoke exactly 3 sentences to the drunken man in a low, even voice, and somehow, a man twice her size obediently lowered himself into a chair, like a schoolboy who had been caught misbehaving. There was no panic, no trembling, not the slightest trace of drama. Ronan had been standing at the far end of the hall that night, and what stayed with him wasn't the 3 sentences she had spoken, but the absolute calm in those ash-gray eyes, the calm of someone who seemed to have witnessed things far more frightening than this. He ordered her employment records brought to him. Marin Ashford, 27 years old, employed at the mansion for 2 years. No family, no debts, not a single complaint from anyone, a woman who was almost invisible among the mansion's vast household staff. She had no family name she could use against him, no ambition that might tempt her to betray him, no allegiance to any other family that could turn her into someone else's dagger. A perfect signature. But when Ronan summoned her to his study and placed the proposal before her, along with a sum large enough to leave anyone stunned, the woman merely listened in silence until he had finished, then bowed politely and said she had to decline. She left the study as quietly as she had entered it, leaving the most powerful crime lord in Boston, sitting motionless before something he had never encountered in his life, a person who didn't need his money. He would never have learned the real reason if fate itself hadn't brought the answer to him 2 weeks later. In a neighborhood on the south side of the city stood an aging red brick building called Sparrow House, a home for 30 orphaned girls, where the sound of children's laughter rose each afternoon from a small courtyard covered in colorful chalk drawings. Very few people knew that for years, nearly every dollar earned by a quiet maid on Crown Point Hill had been sent there to keep the place alive. Then the landlord announced that the building was being put up for sale. 30 children were suddenly in danger of losing the only home they had ever known, and Marin Ashford, the woman who had turned down a fortune, stood before the doors of Ronan Gallagher's study for the second time. Only now she was the one who had requested the meeting. Her condition was so simple that he laughed because he couldn't believe it. She didn't ask for jewelry, a private account, or a share of his fortune when the contract ended. She wanted him to purchase the red brick building outright and establish an operating fund sufficient to sustain it for 20 years. He agreed that very afternoon, never knowing that across the desk, the woman with the ash-gray eyes was telling herself she had just placed the greatest wager she had made since arriving in Boston, because stepping into the light cast by the Gallagher name meant stepping into a place where every eye would turn toward her. But a contract wife hidden behind the walls of the estate was still less exposed than an unemployed maid wandering the streets. The wedding took place 10 days later in the family's private chapel, as cold and lifeless as the contract that had been signed before the ceremony. There were no flowers, no guests beyond the handful of required witnesses, a plain ring without a single word engraved upon it, and the kiss that ended the ceremony was nothing more than a formal brush of his lips against her cheek. When the two of them signed the last of the documents, Ronan spoke to her in the voice of a man closing a business deal and told her not to misunderstand. He didn't need a wife. He only needed a signature that was still breathing. Marin raised her eyes to him without anger, without hurt, holding only that familiar, unfathomable calm. And once again, the man who had never faltered before anyone found himself pausing for half a second without understanding why. The only person who seemed to see something no one else in the chapel could was the old man seated in a wheelchair in the front pew. When the bride approached to greet him, Cormac Gallagher took her hand in fingers already trembling with illness and held it for a long time, then whispered a sentence people would repeat many times afterward. "This girl has the eyes of someone who has walked through fire." Ronan assumed they were the confused words of a man nearing the end of his life. Marin merely lowered her head and said nothing. No one in the chapel that day understood what the old man meant. No one understood at all. Not until it was far too late to ask him. The first 3 months of that marriage passed like two parallel rails that never touched. Less than a week after the wedding, Cormac Gallagher died in his sleep, and the Crown Point mansion settled into a new kind of order, one in which the husband lived in the East Wing with meetings that stretched past midnight, while the wife lived in the West Wing with a silence she had known long before she ever carried the Gallagher name. On paper, Marin was now the mistress of the largest estate on the hill, yet she continued living like a maid, as though the wedding gown had never once touched her shoulders. She rose before 5 o'clock while the entire house was still buried in darkness, pressed her own clothes instead of sending them down to the laundry room, made her own bed, brewed the first pot of tea of the day, and devoted those quiet hours before dawn to the small herb garden behind the kitchen, where she grew rosemary, mint, and sage in beds she had shaped with her own hands back when she still wore a servant's uniform. At first, the household staff didn't know how to behave around their new mistress, but within a few weeks, they realized that this woman had no desire to be bowed to. She remembered the name of every gardener, knew that the gatekeeper's young child had just recovered from an illness, and never once raised her voice at anyone. The only person in the mansion who was truly close to her was Josie Alvarez, the 31-year-old head cook whose smile seemed larger than her entire frame. The only friend who knew Marin took her coffee without sugar and hated the scent of lilies, though even Josie had never heard her speak about anything that had happened before the day she appeared in Boston. On Saturday afternoons, Josie often brought her little daughter into the kitchen to play while she prepared dinner, and those were the rare moments when laughter could be heard echoing through the gray stone mansion. One afternoon, Marin sat down on a wooden chair beside the oven, opened a book of fairy tales, and began reading to the little girl. When she reached the part where the wolf knocked on the door of the 3 little pigs, she lowered her voice into a deep rumble and growled in her throat exactly like a cranky old wolf. making the child laugh so hard she nearly fell from her chair, then tug at Marin's sleeve and beg her to read that part 3 more times. Josie stood by the stove watching, wiping her hands on her apron, and thought that this woman had been born to be a mother, never knowing that the voice of that old wolf had once been practiced in rooms no child should ever have known existed. With Ronan, everything between them remained exactly as the contract required. Shared dinners when guests needed to see them together, public appearances frequent enough to keep the council from becoming suspicious, polite exchanges about the weather and their schedules. But there were small openings no contract could have anticipated. One morning, before an important meeting with the family council, Ronan came down into the great hall wearing a crooked tie without realizing it, and Marin, who was passing by with a tea tray in her hands, set the tray down, stepped toward him, and straightened the knot with a movement as natural as breathing, neat, precise, and without the slightest hesitation. Only when her fingers left his collar did they both become still. She because she realized what she had just done, and he because he realized he had stood there and allowed her to do it. And for several strangely long seconds, neither of them said a word. Then she picked up the tea tray and continued on her way, while he walked out to the car with the feeling that the knot of his tie remained warmer than usual throughout the entire meeting. No one in the mansion knew that the calm woman sometimes went through entire nights without sleeping. She kept a small tin sewing box in the drawer of her private room, an object so ordinary that no one would think to look at it twice. And beneath the spools of colored thread at the bottom lay a bracelet woven from yarn, its colors worn pale by the years. Sometimes, on certain nights, she took it out and held it in the palm of her hand for a long while, without crying, without saying a word, then placed it back where it belonged, as though burying something 1 inch deeper into the earth. There were nights when she woke suddenly from dreams she never told anyone about, sat upright in the darkness with her back straight and both hands resting on her knees, then began counting her breaths according to some old exercise, breathing in for 4 counts, holding for 7, breathing out for 8, repeating it again and again, until her heartbeat slowed and the darkness in the room became nothing more than darkness. The following morning, she was still the first person awake. She returned to the herb garden, calm once more, her face smooth as water without a ripple. And no one, not even the husband in name who slept in the opposite wing, could guess what lay beneath that surface. Then one evening near the end of the 3rd month, while Marin was trimming the last rosemary sprigs before nightfall, Patrick Donnelly knocked on the door of Ronan's study wearing the expression the old steward carried only when something was seriously wrong. He placed a thin file of reports on the desk and said in a low voice that Sterling Voss had been holding secret dealings with at least 3 neutral families, discreet dinners, gifts given without explanation, all of it happening with unusual frequency, just before the inheritance confirmation hearing. Ronan turned through the pages one by one, his jaw tightening with each report, but what made him look up sharply was Donnelly's final sentence, spoken slowly and clearly, every word distinct. Among the questions Voss's people had been scattering throughout the city, some weren't about the docks, weren't about contracts, and weren't about money. They were about the new Gallagher wife, where she had come from, what she had done before entering the mansion, and why a crime lord would choose to marry a maid whose origins no one knew. Outside in the garden behind the kitchen, Marin cut the final sprig of rosemary, unaware that somewhere in the city, the false name she had carried for 5 years had just been written on a sheet of paper beside a question mark. 2 weeks after the evening Donnelly brought him that report. The heaviest rain of the autumn poured down over Boston, and it was also the night an urgent call drew Ronan away from the mansion at 9 o'clock, an unexpected dispute between 2 groups of dock workers at the harbor that required the crime lord himself to be present. The sort of trouble that sounded reasonable enough that no one had time to wonder why it had erupted on a night when the rain was thick enough to blind the entire city. The convoy passed through the gates with most of the security detail, and during that night shift, in one corner of the security screens covering the west wing, 3 cameras quietly switched into maintenance mode, without any report being recorded. A side door beside the herb garden failed to send a signal when it was opened, and no one in the control room noticed, because the man seated before those screens was the one who had turned them off. 4 shadows crossed the wall through the rain, moving with the clean, disciplined order of men who had been shown the building plans beforehand. The assignment Sterling Voss had given them was clear down to the final word. They weren't to take the woman's life, because a funeral for Mrs. Gallagher would ignite a war Voss wasn't ready to begin. What he needed was for them to take her alive, bring her somewhere private, and by whatever means necessary, force her to sign a separation agreement already prepared and dated before the wedding, a signature sufficient for the family council to declare Ronan Gallagher's marriage a fraudulent performance, sufficient to disqualify him from the inheritance provision, and sufficient to tear the entire empire into pieces for the men already waiting to divide it. In theory, it was the easiest assignment the four men had ever received. The target was nothing more than a maid whose title had changed, a quiet woman with no personal bodyguard. And at this hour she was usually alone in the large kitchen. They found her exactly where their information said she would be, standing beside the long wooden table and drying the last of the cups, with a silver tray resting near her elbow, while the entire kitchen held only the warm yellow light above the sink and the steady tapping of rain against the glass panes. The first man entered ahead of the others, his broad shoulders nearly filling the doorway, while the remaining three spread out to block the hall and the door leading down to the cellar, forming a trap within the space of a few breaths. Maren didn't turn around at once. She set the cup down, folded the drying cloth neatly into quarters, then lifted her eyes and studied all four strangers with the gaze of someone taking inventory. Slowly, and one by one, from the large man near the door, to the thin man shifting nervously from one foot to the other, to the short, thick-set man with one hand already hidden inside his coat, before finally stopping on the man in the middle, the one who stood with the loose posture of someone accustomed to giving orders. He smirked, and told the lady of the house not to make things complicated. She only had to come with them, sign a piece of paper, and afterward she could disappear wherever she pleased. They would even give her money to disappear. Maren placed the folded cloth on the table, and in a low, even voice, no faster than when she spoke about the weather, she told them they should leave. The leader laughed and asked whether she knew how to count, because there were 4 men standing in that kitchen. She told them a second time that she wasn't asking. The back door was still open, the rain would wash away their footprints, and they still had time. The thin man cursed impatiently and urged the others to finish it. Then Maren spoke for the 3rd time, a little more slowly and a little more clearly, telling them they should leave, not because she was pleading with them, but because they didn't understand where they had just walked into. In the half-second of silence that followed, the only thing moving in the kitchen was the blinking red light of an old security camera mounted high in one corner of the ceiling, the only camera powered by a separate electrical line the traitor knew nothing about. Then the large man lost patience first. He lunged forward to seize her arm, a simple restraint he had used 100 times before, and it was the last simple thing that happened in that kitchen that night. Maren turned half a circle before his hand could close around her, so lightly that it looked as though she were merely stepping aside for someone in a hurry, and her elbow found the center of his chest with a short, measured strike, just strong enough to stop his breath and soften his knees. She locked his arm, borrowed the force of his momentum, and sent him down onto the stone floor as neatly as though she were setting down a sack of flour. The thin man rushed her from the left with a knife, and the silver tray left the table for exactly 1 beat, crossing the path of the blade as metal struck metal with a sharp, dry sound. The wrist holding the knife was caught and turned through an arc his entire body was forced to follow, and he saw the ceiling roll beneath him before his back struck the stone, while the knife had somehow already come to rest on the table 3 steps away. The short, thick-set man managed to pull the gun from his coat, but the drying cloth folded into quarters, flew through the air, and wrapped around his wrist like a soft chain. 1 pull, 1 turn, and the gun changed hands before being broken into 2 pieces and dropped into the sink. He was carried along by the same motion, his shoulder slamming into the edge of a wooden cabinet before he slid to the floor, staring wide-eyed at the ceiling without understanding the order in which any of it had happened. The leader was the only one who had stepped back quickly enough to watch, and also the only one who understood that something was terribly wrong with the intelligence they had been given. He chose to charge her with the full weight of his body, instead of relying on technique, hoping to crush her beneath his size, but the woman merely shifted 1 foot to the side and allowed all that weight to pass her. 1 hand blocked his elbow, 1 foot swept away his balance, and the marble floor caught him so quickly that the impact came before he could make a sound. 40 seconds passed from the first charge until the kitchen became silent again, leaving only the rain and the sound of 4 men breathing heavily on the floor. Maren stood among their motionless bodies, her breathing as steady as when she had been drying the cups, her uniform without a single wrinkle, not 1 strand of hair loose from the low knot at the back of her neck. She bent down and looked at the leader as he tried in vain to raise himself on 1 elbow. And at the precise moment his eyes met her face from that close distance beneath the yellow light, his pupils widened at something that wasn't pain. He stared at her as though he were looking at a dead woman returned to life, and before consciousness left him, one word slipped from his lips. Thimble. Marin went completely still. Half a second. Only half a second. But it was the only moment she faltered throughout that entire night, and it lasted longer than all the blows combined. She seized him by the collar, intending to question him, but his head had already fallen to one side. Consciousness gone before she could open her mouth. The kitchen was utterly silent, while the red light in the corner of the ceiling continued to blink with steady patience, recording everything. Marin rose to her feet and looked at the camera for 1 second, her face revealing nothing. Then she took the telephone from her apron pocket and called her husband. When he answered amid the sound of rain at the harbor, she spoke in the voice of someone reporting a household matter and said, "There are 4 strangers in the kitchen. I'm fine. You should send someone before they wake up." At the other end of the line, amid the rain lashing the corrugated roof of the harbor warehouse and the shouting of the dock workers, Ronan Gallagher heard every word of his wife's report, and for one moment he thought he had misunderstood her, because her voice was so calm that he nearly asked whether the 4 strangers were plumbers or delivery men. Then the meaning of each word struck him all at once. 4 strangers, in the kitchen, before they wake up. And a feeling this man had never tasted in all 33 years of his life crawled along his spine, cold and sharp, the thing the men under his command called by one simple word: fear. He left the harbor dispute in the hands of his lieutenants. A dispute he would only later understand had been nothing more than a puppet staged to lure him away from the house, and the black car tore through the rain toward the hill at a speed that forced the 2 escort vehicles to struggle to keep up. The drive from the harbor to Crown Point normally took nearly half an hour. That night, he made it in 12 minutes, and throughout those 12 minutes, he didn't say a word. There were only his fingers clenched white around the steering wheel, and the image of the woman in the ash-gray uniform returning again and again to his mind, the woman he had promised himself he would protect as an unwritten clause of honor outside the contract. The mansion gates had barely opened when he was already out of the car, crossing the great hall in long strides, brushing past the steward who tried to give him a report. And when the kitchen door opened, what he saw stopped him for a heartbeat. 4 large men lay unconscious across the marble floor like objects someone had set down and forgotten. A knife rested carelessly on the wooden table. 2 dismantled pieces of a gun sat in the sink. And in the middle of it all, his wife was pouring boiling water into a teapot, as though preparing to receive guests. He crossed the room in 3 steps, seized her shoulders with both hands, and turned her to face him. His eyes moved from her face to her throat, then down both arms, searching for a scratch, a handprint, a tear in the fabric, any proof that she had passed through the same thing the 4 men on the floor had passed through, and he found nothing, not a single mark. But what sent a chill through his spine wasn't the fact that she was unharmed. It was what he felt beneath his palms. Her shoulders weren't tense, and when he took both her hands and turned them upward to examine them, her fingers rested quietly in his, warm, soft, and absolutely steady. He had seen men survive executions and bloody reprisals. Even the hardest among them needed a cigarette and a glass of whiskey to keep their hands from betraying them. Yet the woman who had just brought down 4 armed men stood before him with the heartbeat of someone who had merely finished watering a bed of rosemary. The question left him before he could consider it, low and hoarse. "Who are you?" Marin looked back at him, her ash-gray eyes still that same lake without a ripple, and answered with a single sentence: "The wife you hired, nothing more." Then she gently withdrew her hands from his, turned back to the steaming teapot, and left the most powerful man in Boston standing in the middle of the kitchen with an answer that was correct, down to every word on the contract, and wrong to its very foundation, in every other meaning. That night, Ronan's security team worked in absolute silence. The 4 intruders were bound, gagged, and removed from the mansion through the back entrance in an unmarked cargo van, then taken to a warehouse outside the city where the family's men would have long conversations with them. Not a single police officer was called, because in the world of those who carried the Gallagher name, some matters were settled under a different law. The master of the mansion sat alone in his study until well after midnight, staring at a computer screen that replayed the footage from the old kitchen camera connected to its own power line, a recording less than 1 minute long that he had already watched 17 times. He watched the woman neatly fold her cleaning cloth before the 4 shadows closed in around her. He watched her lips move 3 times through warnings he knew by heart, even without sound. He watched the silver tray block the knife, the cloth wrap around the wrist holding the gun, the turns so economical that there wasn't a single wasted movement. And what he watched most often was the final half-second, when the leader looked up at her and said something that made the woman who had never faltered suddenly freeze, as though struck by an invisible blow. The half-second the camera captured without sound, showing only his wife seizing the collar of the unconscious man, and a question dying on her lips. Donnelly had stood beside the desk since the 10th replay, silent in the manner of a man who had served 3 generations of the Gallagher family, and believed there was nothing left in the world he hadn't seen. At last, he spoke, slowly admitting that in 40 years of service, he had seen retired special forces, soldiers, and elite contract killers brought in from overseas by the families, but he had never seen anyone move like that. His voice dropped lower for the final sentence. "Sir, someone like that isn't born. Someone like that is made." In the west wing of the mansion, behind the locked door of her private room, Marin sat beside a small desk lamp and quietly opened each layer of the life called Marin Ashford, examining it the way a jeweler studies every soldered seam. The papers, the names, the arranged years, one layer after another, and she told no one about the name that had been spoken in the kitchen that night. She checked everything until nearly dawn, then returned it all to its hiding place, turned off the lamp, and lay down with her eyes open in the darkness. And in the security control room beneath the basement, at some point between the rain-soaked night and the coming dawn, a hand quietly inserted a memory card into the server, copied a file 59 seconds long, erased all traces of access, and when the sun rose over Crown Point Hill, the recording of those 40 seconds no longer remained inside the mansion. Nearly an hour's drive from Crown Point Hill, behind the sealed gates of a private estate in the western outskirts of the city, lived a man who had never appeared in a single news report, yet held the lifeblood of half the East Coast underworld in his hands. Sterling Voss, 52 years old, with silver hair combed straight back without a single strand out of place, gold-rimmed glasses, and the velvet voice of a man who had never needed to raise it, was known throughout the trade by a title spoken with equal parts, reverence and fear, the Banker of Darkness. For 20 years, dirty money from casinos, smuggling networks, and nameless transactions all along the East Coast had been forced to pass through his system before emerging into the light as legitimate investments. And what he collected wasn't merely a percentage, but secrets as well, an asset he valued more than money. Yet there was one wound 2 decades had never allowed to close. The day Ronan Gallagher's father cast him out of the Harbor Alliance in front of the families, severing his hand from the greatest artery in the entire region. And Voss, a man who never forgot a debt, had spent 20 years nurturing a plan to reclaim everything with compound interest. Old Cormac's death and the strange provision in his will were the opportunity he had waited all those years to seize. All he needed was for the heir's marriage to collapse before the confirmation hearing, and the Gallagher empire would be torn into pieces, while he would stand ready to collect each one at the price offered by the only buyer in the market. That was why 4 men had been hired through 3 layers of intermediaries so no trace could ever lead back to him, their assignment no more complicated than bringing back a signature from a maid. And that was why, tonight, when the message arriving at the estate contained only a single line, saying all 4 men had vanished without a trace after entering the mansion, Voss sat motionless behind his desk for a very long time, his fingers interlaced, searching his mind for some overlooked variable that could explain a result so absurd. Standing across the desk was Mercer, his closest advisor, a thin man in his mid-40s with a sharp, expressionless face and eyes as cold as 2 needles. A man the servants at the estate feared even more than their master, because Voss merely destroyed a person's property, while Mercer, according to rumors no one dared repeat in full, had once done things money couldn't describe. On the second day, the trader inside Crown Point delivered something more valuable than any written report, a file 59 seconds long copied from the security server, and in a room with every curtain drawn, Sterling Voss watched the footage as his glasses slowly slipped down the bridge of his nose. He watched the quiet maid set down her cup as 4 shadows closed around her. He watched the silver tray stop the knife. He watched the gun come apart into 2 pieces. He watched 4 men fall motionless onto the stone floor in less time than it took him to prepare a cup of tea, and when the screen went dark, he removed his glasses and polished them with a silk handkerchief, a habit that appeared only when the fastest calculating mind on the East Coast encountered an equation that refused to yield an answer. Mercer, however, didn't need all 59 seconds. He needed only the first 3. Exactly 3 seconds. beginning with the moment the woman in the recording turned half a circle to evade the first man's grasp, and the color slowly drained from the face of a man who seemed incapable of expression. His thin fingers clutched the back of the chair until the knuckles turned white, because he recognized what no one else alive could have recognized from a grainy piece of footage. He recognized those brutally economical turns. He recognized the way the elbow found the center of the chest through a short strike measured in tenths of a second. He recognized the entire discipline that had produced that sequence of movement, a discipline taught by no military force and no fighting school anywhere on Earth. Voss asked for his opinion, and for the first time in many years of service, Mercer offered advice in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. "Burn the recording, sir. Burn it. Bury this matter, and never send anyone near that woman again." Sterling Voss looked at his advisor over the rim of his glasses, and then he did what he had done all his life whenever he caught the scent of an undervalued asset. He did the opposite. Inside that mind, which never stopped calculating, a new move had already begun to take shape, one more elegant and more poisonous than the original plan. If this woman truly was what Mercer's reaction implied, then the 59-second recording wasn't evidence of failure. It was a card, and a card had to be played at precisely the right moment. Release it, and every member of the family council would ask the same question. Why would a crime lord marry a maid with no known history? And what kind of maid could bring down 4 armed men in 40 seconds? The most natural answer would also be the most malicious, that Ronan Gallagher had invited into his bed an assassin planted by some hidden power, or worse, that the marriage itself was a performance carrying the smell of gunpowder, and suspicion alone would be enough to isolate the heir before the approaching confirmation hearing. As for the second purpose, Voss didn't speak it aloud, not even to Mercer. He only smiled to himself as he considered it. Because if the woman truly was something rare, something that had once belonged to a world even more secretive than his own, then somewhere beyond those walls there had to be professional hunters who had been searching for her for years, people with resources and motives he wouldn't have to spend a cent to hire. The recording would serve as a bell calling the pack, and Sterling Voss's hands would remain as clean as always while others carried out the dirty work for him. That night, from a server located overseas, the 59-second recording was released onto a private forum used by the Boston underworld, and what happened afterward slipped beyond anyone's control. Within 48 hours, it had reached New York, and then Chicago, entered the encrypted messaging channels, criminal organizations, across different time zones used to communicate, been replayed in smoke-filled rooms, and examined frame by experienced eyes. And everywhere it traveled, people asked the same question: who was the woman in that kitchen? Back at the Western estate, as Voss raised a glass of wine to celebrate the move he had made, Mercer stood beside the window staring into the darkness for a very long time, and at last he spoke in a flat voice without the slightest rise or fall, like a man reading a sentence rather than delivering a warning. "You don't understand what you've just awakened, Mr. Voss, but I do." On the third morning after that rainy night, the telephone in Ronan Gallagher's study rang 4 times before he had even finished his first cup of coffee. The first call came from the Kavanagh family elder, his tone full of polite concern, though every sentence was a blade wrapped in velvet, saying that he had heard something had happened at the Crown Point mansion, and that Mrs. Gallagher was clearly a woman of many unexpected talents. The second call came from the Brennan family and was more direct, asking whether it was true that Ronan's wife had taken down 4 armed men in less than a minute, and if it was, where she had learned to do such a thing. The third came from a neutral family that had never contacted him first before, and the fourth, the call that kept his jaw clenched the longest, came from a member of the council, who informed him in a solemn voice that before the approaching confirmation hearing, the council expected complete transparency regarding the background of the woman carrying the Gallagher name, because a recording was spreading across the East Coast, and what it showed looked nothing like any maid they had ever known. Ronan put down the telephone, opened his computer, and needed only 2 minutes to find what the entire city was passing from hand to hand: the 59-second recording from his own kitchen, something that should have existed only on the server beneath the basement, now posted on a private forum with thousands of views and a single title: "Who is Gallagher's woman?" He sat motionless for a long time, not because of the recording, because he already knew every frame of it by heart, but because of a colder truth, that the person who had leaked it was eating at his table and breathing beneath the same roof. He found his wife exactly where he knew he would find her, in the herb garden behind the kitchen. surrounded by morning mist that hadn't yet lifted, kneeling on one knee beside the sage bed with pruning shears in her hand. And for a moment, as he stood at the end of the gravel path watching her, he thought the scene looked so peaceful it felt dishonest. The woman gently tending each branch, and the woman in that recording couldn't possibly be the same person. Yet they were. He approached, gravel crunching beneath his shoes, and she looked up without surprise, as though she had heard him from the moment he was still inside the house. He didn't circle around the matter. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight as he told her that the recording from that night was everywhere. New York had seen it. Chicago had seen it. 4 calls had come one after another that morning. The families were demanding an answer. The council was demanding an answer. And he himself, the man who had signed his name beside hers on their marriage certificate, was standing there with the same question he had asked in the kitchen and had never truly had answered. Marin rose to her feet, brushed the soil from the hem of her skirt, and remained silent. He continued, more slowly this time, placing each word between them as though laying it on a table, saying that the contract stated she wasn't allowed to lie to him. She answered calmly, without evasion, that the contract said she wasn't allowed to betray him, and she never had. The answer was true in a way that left him helpless, because he had examined everything in his mind over the past 3 days and couldn't find a single thing she had done to harm him. She had only concealed something, an immense darkness behind the name Marin Ashford, and now that darkness was dragging his entire empire into suspicion at the most dangerous possible moment. He asked, sounding more exhausted than angry, how long she intended to remain silent, whether she understood what awaited them before the confirmation hearing, and that people were no longer asking only about her. They had begun asking about him, asking what Ronan Gallagher had truly brought into his home and married. Marin looked at him, and for the first time since the wedding, he saw a crack pass through her composure, faint as a hairline fracture in porcelain, as she said that she was asking him for something she had never asked of anyone before. Time. Her voice faltered on the final word, dropping lower, no longer calm and level, as she said that there were doors which, once opened, could never be closed again, and she needed to be certain she could endure whatever might step through them, not for herself, but for everyone standing beside her. Ronan studied the woman before him for a long time, the woman who had asked him for time in a breaking voice while her spine remained straight, and inside him, the husband in name and the man who had watched that recording 17 times struggled against one another. At last, he nodded and said all right. He wouldn't force her, but in return he had one condition, and this condition existed outside every document they had ever signed. Beginning that day, she would move into the East Wing, the wing where he lived. She opened her mouth to refuse out of instinct, but he stopped her before she could speak, his voice lowering as he told her it wasn't because he suspected her. It was because after that recording, the entire city was about to hunt her. The curious, those who wanted to buy her, those who wanted to erase her, all of them would come, and he couldn't protect what he couldn't see. Marin stood motionless among the herb beds, dew resting on the shoulders of her dress, looking at the man who had spoken not with the voice of a crime lord issuing an order, but with the voice of someone afraid of losing something. And after a long silence, she gave a slight nod. That afternoon, her few belongings were moved into the East Wing, into the room directly across from his on the other side of a corridor less than 6 steps wide. And their first night beneath the same stretch of roof passed with 2 closed doors facing each other, 2 lamps extinguished late, and neither person on either side able to sleep. Ronan lay staring at the ceiling, his mind turning endlessly through the families, the confirmation hearing, and the traitor whose face remained hidden. Marin lay on her side in the darkness of a room that still carried the unfamiliar scent of wood, and in that drifting place between wakefulness and sleep, old fragments rose without permission, rooms without a single window, the voice of a very young girl coming through an internal communications line and calling Marin by a name spoken with an intonation only the 2 of them understood, the smell of disinfectant soaked into every breath. She opened her eyes. The darkness in the room was only darkness again. She placed one hand against her chest, counted 4 beats as she breathed in, and didn't allow the memory to move another step forward. While the 2 doors facing each other across the East Wing corridor continued to remain awake together night after night, Patrick Donnelly began an investigation on the floor below that he never mentioned to the mistress of the house. The old steward, who had served 3 generations of the Gallagher family, didn't do it out of suspicion. He did it out of loyalty, because he understood a rule that had been paid for in blood over 40 years of service, that no one could protect a person they knew nothing about. And after the recording, now spreading across the East Coast, the woman in the East Wing needed protection more than anyone else beneath that roof. He began with the most basic things: employment records, old rental documents, tax files, banking history, and acquaintances from the time she had worked at a small hotel in the southern part of the city before entering the mansion, and everything matched with flawless precision. So flawless that it became suspicious. Marin Ashford had existed on paper for exactly 5 years. Every seal, every signature, and every address was genuine and could be verified. But when Donnelly followed the trail beyond that 5-year mark, every thread snapped at the same point, as though someone had taken a pair of scissors and cut through her entire life with a single stroke. There were no childhood hospital records, no school transcripts, no graduation photograph, and not one acquaintance whose name existed before the day she appeared in Boston, carrying a suitcase and taking a job cleaning rooms. He tried deeper channels. Old friends in the police department, a contact at the federal tax agency, even a man who specialized in reconstructing identities for the underworld, and whom the Gallagher family had kept within reach, and they all returned with the same answer, one that left even them confused. There was nothing to find, not because it had been concealed, but because it didn't exist. On the 4th night of the investigation, Donnelly knocked on the study door with a file so thin it was almost empty, and the face of a man who had just encountered something beyond all his professional experience. He placed the papers before Ronan and said slowly, "Sir, I have investigated false identities for this family for 40 years. No matter how skilled an identity thief may be, there is always a seam left behind, a seal from the wrong period, a witness whose account doesn't match, but there isn't a single seam here. Your wife's past wasn't fabricated, sir. It was erased, and this isn't identity theft. This is erasure at a government level, the kind only agencies whose names never appear on an administrative map possess the authority and skill to carry out." Ronan turned through the nearly blank pages, and the strangest feeling wasn't fear, but the realization that he had been sleeping only 6 steps across a corridor from someone who was invisible. It was Donnelly who found the only surviving thread, not through computers or money, but through the kind of asset only a family with 3 generations of history could possess: an old debt of honor. In the ledger of obligations left behind by Cormac was the name of a retired intelligence officer whose career and life the old crime lord had saved 40 years earlier during an incident no document had ever recorded, and the debt had never been collected. Donnelly approached the man with a single question and the name of a program inferred from the empty spaces. And 3 days later, an envelope without a sender appeared in the mansion mailbox. There wasn't a single written line inside. Only a photograph reproduced from a low-quality scan, something recovered from leaked data belonging to an international security contractor that had collapsed amid scandal nearly a decade earlier. The photograph showed a training yard in an unknown location, with 6 recruits dressed in gray standing in a line. Every face was blurred by distance and poor image quality, while only the man standing before them remained clear. A silver-haired figure with a rigid posture and cold eyes staring straight through the camera lens. Along the bottom of the photograph was a caption almost entirely blacked out, leaving only a few words visible: Dr. E. Lang, Halcyon, the rest redacted. Ronan sat alone with the photograph for a long time after Donnelly left the study. He examined every blurred face in the line of gray uniforms: one person whose shoulders leaned slightly, another who was noticeably shorter, another standing so straight it seemed as though a ruler had been drawn along the spine, and he kept asking himself a question with no answer. Which of those 6 shadows was the woman who still knelt beside the sage bed, behind his kitchen each morning? Which one was the woman who had straightened his tie with warm fingers? And what had been done to her? Inside what rooms? For a human being to be blurred so completely, not only in a photograph, but across the entire face of the earth. Meanwhile, the pressure outside didn't wait for him to find the answer. Messages seeking information began pouring into the family's communication channels from sources that couldn't be traced. An offer to purchase information for a 7-figure price from an anonymous address. An offhand question about Mrs. Gallagher sent through 3 layers of intermediaries by an unnamed organization overseas. And most troubling of all were the silences, the people who asked nothing. Though his men reported that unfamiliar faces had begun appearing around the base of Crown Point Hill, only watching, only memorizing, and then disappearing. The inheritance confirmation hearing was less than 2 months away. Ronan looked at the photograph on his desk one final time, at the name Dr. E. Lang still visible beneath the black ink, then rose without summoning his security detail or informing any lieutenant of his plans. He gave Donnelly only one instruction. "Prepare the car. I'll drive. Just you and me. We're going to Maine." The journey to Maine took nearly 4 hours through pine forests already beginning to turn with the colors of late autumn, and throughout the drive, the two men in the car barely spoke to one another. Ronan drove with the folded photograph in his breast pocket, while Donnelly sat in the passenger seat, checking one last time the address the retired intelligence officer had hastily written on the back of an old business card, an address with no street name, only the number of a post office box in a coastal town and a brief note. "The wooden house at the bottom of the hill. He'll know before you knock." They found the place in the middle of the afternoon, a low wooden house standing apart from the town and facing a gray bay. And the first thing that caught Ronan's attention wasn't the house, but the garden surrounding it. Vegetable beds as straight as lines drawn with a ruler, a wooden fence freshly painted without a single slat overlooked, firewood stacked beside the house in a block so precise that every inch seemed measured, everything radiating a quiet discipline he had seen in only one other person in the world. The woman who knelt beside the sage beds behind his kitchen every morning. And exactly as the note had warned, the owner of the house wasn't surprised. He was already seated on the wooden porch with a pot of tea and 3 cups, a 68-year-old man with snow-white hair, his back still as straight as the pine tree behind the house, his eyes so sharp that anyone facing him felt as though they were being read from the inside out. And when the 2 visitors were still 10 steps from the porch, he spoke first in the dry, low voice of a man who hadn't needed to raise it in many years, saying that he had wondered how long it would take Mr. Gallagher. 3 weeks since the recording began circulating. Not bad, though your grandfather probably would have managed it a few days sooner. Ronan stopped in the middle of the gravel path, and for a moment he understood that every advantage he had prepared during the 4-hour drive was meaningless. This man already knew who he was, knew why he had come, and perhaps had known before Ronan himself did. Dr. Everett Lang poured tea into all 3 cups, gestured for his visitors to sit in the 2 plain wooden chairs opposite him, and wasted no time on polite formalities. He said directly that Ronan had come to ask about a woman in a kitchen, so he should ask. He would say what he was permitted to say, and Ronan would have to learn to live with what he couldn't reveal. Ronan placed the photograph on the wooden table between them, the image of 6 recruits in gray standing with their instructor still clearly visible, and the old man looked down at the younger version of his own face for a long while. Something softened in those sharp eyes. Then he quietly asked how the girl was doing. When Ronan answered that she tended an herb garden, read stories to the cook's daughter, and hadn't raised her voice at anyone in 2 years, the old man nodded slowly as though that was precisely the answer he had been waiting for, and then he began to speak. He said that during all his years teaching for a program whose name he had no authority to disclose, he had watched hundreds of people walk through its gates. Most of them broke before the end of their first year. A small number became exceptional, and a few, only a very few, became something the world wasn't allowed to know existed. The woman in your kitchen, Mr. Gallagher, was the finest student I ever trained, with the fastest reflexes I ever measured, and the sharpest instincts I ever tested. But those aren't the reasons I still remember her now. He paused and looked out across the gray bay for a while, then continued in a slower voice, saying that she was the only one among them all, who always refused to take a life when another path remained, even when that other path was 10 times harder and 10 times more painful. The instructors recorded it as a weakness. They made her pay for it through tests I don't wish to describe, and still she didn't change. Do you know something? They were wrong all those years. It was never a weakness. It was what made the girl extraordinary, because in that profession, holding on to a principle is 100 times harder than holding on to your life. Ronan asked about her past, about why someone like her would abandon everything to clean floors in a Boston mansion, and at that, the old man fell silent for a very long time, so long that only the sound of the wind moving through the pine trees remained. At last, he spoke one sentence, weighing every word as carefully as someone measuring poison. The program bound the girl with a chain of blood. The day that chain broke, they lost control of her, and she lost her final reason to obey. Don't ask me anything more about that chain. It's her story, and only she has the right to tell it. Then, as though trying to fill the heavy silence, He poured more tea and casually mentioned something that seemed unrelated, saying that his work hadn't only been to teach, but also to remove. During his career, he had personally struck one trainee's name from the program, even though that person's abilities ranked among the best in the class. Do you know why? Because that trainee was too willing to kill. He killed the way another person might scratch an itch, and a blade without a sheath will eventually cut the hand holding it. The old man didn't give a name, and Ronan didn't ask. Neither visitor sitting on that porch that afternoon could have imagined that the name erased all those years ago was now standing behind drawn curtains in the western outskirts of Boston. Before seeing his guests off, the old man rose from his chair, and for the first time, his voice carried a sense of urgency. He said that Ronan had to understand one thing: that recording hadn't merely exposed his wife's abilities. It was a bell. And a bell summoned two kinds of people: those who wanted to reclaim a lost asset, and those who wanted to silence a witness who knew too much. Both kinds had already heard it. Believe me, they're coming. They may already be there. And you, with all your guns and walls, won't be able to stop them while you and the girl remain on opposite sides of a wall of silence. Ronan rose as well, and asked one final question. What am I supposed to do? Dr. Everett Lang looked directly into the eyes of the young man standing before him on the porch, and the sharpness in his gaze softened into something almost like a dying man's final request. Then he said, "Don't interrogate the girl, Mr. Gallagher. Be her husband. She has carried this alone for far too long." While Ronan's car was still making its way back toward Boston through the pine forests, Sterling Voss was turning to a new page in his ledger of calculations at the estate west of the city. The 4 men he had hired had vanished without a trace, and he was intelligent enough to understand the message hidden inside that silence: that the path of force had been closed forever, and that no gunman he could buy on the market was worth throwing into the kitchen of the Crown Point mansion. But Sterling Voss had never been a man with only one road available to him. Throughout his life, he had won not with his fists, but with seals, bank transfers, and newspaper articles, and behind the rim of his glasses, he told himself with a thin smile that the woman might be able to strip a gun from a man's hand in half a breath, but he would like to see how she stripped away an inspection order. The first blow fell on Monday morning, when 2 inspectors appeared at the doors of the red brick Sparrow House, carrying an order for an unannounced examination of every financial record because of what the document described in 4 cold words: funds of suspicious origin. Someone had filed an anonymous complaint, alleging that for years, the home had been receiving unexplained streams of money from an individual connected to the underworld. The second blow came only 3 days later, when the shelter's donation account was temporarily frozen by the bank pending investigation, forcing every expense, from groceries to teachers' salaries, to be routed through the personal accounts of those running the home. And the third blow was the most insidious of all. An article appeared on a local news site with a photograph taken in secret of Marin stepping out of a car at the mansion gates, and beneath it was a headline sharpened like a razor: "The mysterious maid of a mafia boss." A cover for what? The article accused no one. It merely asked questions, one after another, about a woman without a past who had suddenly become the wife of Boston's most powerful empire, about the steady flow of money into an orphanage, and about the 40-second recording the entire city had seen, leaving readers to form the most poisonous conclusions in their own minds. The effect spread faster than even the person behind it had expected. By the end of the week, 3 longtime suppliers of food and office materials to Sparrow House had called one after another to cancel their contracts, offering vague explanations about delivery capacity, though everyone understood that the true reason was fear of being associated with a name that now carried the smell of gunpowder across the newspapers. The full weight of it fell upon the adults, upon Marin through long meetings with the Foundation's attorneys, upon Josie through trips. She made herself to the wholesale market at 4 o'clock in the morning to purchase food, upon the shelter director through sleepless nights, balancing every dollar of spending, while behind the gates of the red brick building, 30 children still went to class, still colored new pictures that covered the hallway walls, still chattered excitedly each afternoon as they compared their grades. Not a single ripple from the storm outside was allowed to cross that threshold, because the adults had quietly made a promise to one another that no matter what happened, the childhood inside that courtyard was ground no one would be permitted to touch. Josie was the first to recognize the shape of the storm. On Friday evening, she drove up to the mansion with a thick file tucked beneath her arm, and spread everything across the wooden table in the same kitchen where 4 strangers had once lain unconscious: the anonymous complaint, the inspection order, the bank's notice freezing the account, the printed article with passages she had highlighted, and the 3 letters canceling the supply contracts. Then she looked directly into her friend's eyes and spoke in the voice of someone who had checked the same calculation again and again. 3 blows in 5 days, Marin, all aimed at the same place, all delivered in the same way. This isn't a coincidence. Someone is trying to burn down everything you built, and I need to know what we're fighting. The kitchen remained silent for a long time. Marin looked at the only friend she had made during her 5 years in the city, the woman who had never once asked about the empty spaces in her life, and she understood that her silence was no longer protecting anyone. It was becoming a burden laid across the shoulders of innocent people. So for the first time, she opened the door she had kept locked for 5 years. Only a little. She spoke slowly, each word lifted from somewhere very deep, saying that before Boston, she had been someone else, living a life she hadn't chosen, but had been forced to endure. She had left it because she wanted to spend what remained of her life helping people live, instead of doing the things she had once been made to do. The person attacking them now wasn't attacking because of the shelter. He was attacking because of her, because he wanted to drag her out of the darkness where she had been hiding. And Josie, you have every right to step away. You have a daughter. You owe me nothing. Josie listened without blinking, and then she did something Marin hadn't expected. She reached across the table, took her friend's hand, and squeezed it firmly. Listen to me carefully, she said. You never lied to me. You simply didn't tell me everything. Those are 2 different things. The person I have known for 5 years, the woman who taught my daughter how to sound like a wolf, the woman who remembers the birthday of every child in that shelter. That is the real you. Tell me the rest when you're ready. But right now, we fight. Yet later that night, after Josie had gone home, the conflict revealed another front, one far darker than the first. Donnelly brought 2 discoveries to the East Wing that he had uncovered while reviewing the night of the intrusion. The first concerned the security duty roster, where Captain Fitch's name appeared beside a series of unusual gaps, 2 unexplained absences from his post. On the very night the 3 cameras in the West Wing entered maintenance mode, and 1 entry into the server room outside his assigned shift 4 days earlier. Each detail could be explained on its own, but placed beside the others, they formed a pattern too clear to ignore. The second discovery was a financial document one of Donnelly's men had obtained by chance while tracing the money behind the anonymous complaint. A transfer order from an unidentified intermediary account, a large sum paid into an account bearing the name Josie Alvarez, exactly 2 days before the 4 men entered the mansion. Marin held the paper beneath the light for a very long time. The reason trained inside windowless rooms read each number with cold precision and told her that every traitor had once been the person most trusted, that Josie knew her schedule better than anyone, but her heart remembered the hand that had squeezed hers only hours earlier, and the laughter of a child inside this kitchen. For the first time in 8 years, the 2 halves of Marin turned against each other. She stood alone in the empty kitchen, hating the part of herself that had already placed her only friend on a list of suspects, yet unable to silence it. The woman appeared at the gates of the Crown Point mansion on a gray afternoon, 3 days after the night Marin had stood beneath the light, holding the financial document bearing her friend's name. She arrived by taxi and stepped out exactly far enough from the gates for every camera to capture her clearly from head to toe, both hands hanging openly at her sides in the deliberate manner of someone intending to say, "I am carrying nothing." And when the gatekeeper asked for her name, she answered only that he should send Mrs. Gallagher a single word, "Noelle. She'll know." But what caused the security team, already stretched as tight as wire since the night of the intrusion, to alert the upper floor immediately wasn't the name. It was the stranger's walk, each footstep placed with silent, flawless regularity, the distance between every stride differing by less than an inch, her eyes sweeping across the camera's blind spots as naturally as breathing. That wasn't the walk of habit. It was the walk of training. And in the entire mansion, only one other person possessed that kind of movement. The woman now standing motionless behind a second-floor window and looking down with an expression that, for the first time, allowed Donnelly to glimpse something almost identical to shock. Marin had the visitor shown into the small sitting room in the East Wing and closed the door herself. For the first several seconds, the 2 women merely stood looking at each other across the length of the room, with 7 years lying between them like a river. The visitor spoke first, her voice slightly hoarse, saying that she had known it was her even before watching the recording. "Thimble, no one else in the world moves like that. The way you fold a cloth into quarters before striking, The instructors would probably still deduct points for that habit. Marin didn't respond to the joke. She only asked quietly, "You were supposed to be in Europe, Noelle. You promised me you would disappear properly." The woman named Noelle Cade, 35 years old, with a sharply defined face now marked by fine lines at the corners of her eyes, pulled out a chair and sat down without waiting to be invited. She poured herself a cup of tea from the steaming pot as though only yesterday they had still been sharing rations inside the same windowless room, then said that she had disappeared perfectly well for 7 years, until 5 days ago, when a name that should have been dead began appearing for sale through channels both of them knew existed. "I took the first flight available, not to reminisce, but to tell you something face to face, because this cannot be allowed to pass through any form of communication." She set down the teacup, and every trace of weariness vanished from her face. "Listen carefully. There were 4 men in your kitchen that night. 3 were common hired muscle, but the 4th, their leader, didn't work only for the man who hired him. In recent years, he had also taken independent contracts for another network, one devoted to a single profession, hunting people who once belonged to the place where you and I once belonged. He saw your face beneath the kitchen light from an arm's length away, and Marin, he recognized you. The word he let slip before losing consciousness wasn't a question, it was an answer. And before your husband's men could gag him and take him away that night, he managed to do what men like him always do when they discover something valuable. He sold the name. One message, perhaps only a few words, sent during the time between your leaving the kitchen and their being tied up. And that was enough. The room fell silent, leaving only the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corridor. Noelle continued, slowly and distinctly, each word driven down like a nail. "Boston is no longer the only place hunting you, Thimble. That recording made the entire underworld curious, but the name is what caused the truly dangerous people to rise from their chairs. Those who want to recruit you again as though recovering a lost asset, and those who want you silenced forever because what remains in your memory could bury both their careers and the institutions behind them. All of them have heard the bell. I may be only a few days ahead of them, no more." Marin sat motionless and listened, both hands resting quietly on her knees in the posture for receiving a report that had been trained into her bones, then asked the only question she had. "You flew halfway around the world just to tell me to run." Noelle released a short laugh without the slightest trace of amusement and shook her head. "Run. Had I believed you would run, I wouldn't have wasted money on the plane ticket. Someone like you would never have stopped in Boston 7 years ago if disappearing were what you truly wanted. No, Thimble, I'm not telling you to run. I'm telling you to stop hiding. You have hidden long enough, inside a maid's uniform, behind a borrowed name, and worst of all, inside this very house, beside a man who has placed an entire wing of his home around you as protection and still doesn't know whom he is protecting. To survive what is coming, you need something you have never allowed yourself to have, someone standing beside you. And first, you must stop hiding from him." As she said this, Noelle tilted her head slightly toward the sitting room entrance, where the door had somehow opened without either woman noticing. Ronan Gallagher stood there motionless, one hand still resting on the handle, and his face revealed that he had been standing there long enough to hear everything he needed to hear. His eyes met Marin's across the room. Neither of them spoke, and during the endless silence that followed, Noelle Cade rose, straightened the collar of her coat, passed the man in the doorway with a brief nod exchanged between 2 soldiers, then walked down the corridor, descended the stone steps, passed through the mansion gates, and disappeared into the gray afternoon exactly as she had arrived, leaving no trace behind except the words still hanging between the 2 people in that room, and one truth that could never be taken back, that the time for secrets had officially ended. That night, after the figure of the woman named Noelle had disappeared into the gray afternoon, the Crown Point mansion sank into an unusual silence, the kind of silence that comes in the moment before a dam opens its gates. Ronan didn't knock on Marin's door or summon her. He only left a message through Donnelly, saying that whenever she was ready, he would be in the garden. Then he went to the herb garden behind the kitchen, sat down on the stone bench among the rosemary beds, damp with the breath of night, and waited. He waited for nearly 2 hours beneath a Boston autumn sky that was rarely so clear, until the familiar sound of footsteps came along the gravel path, soft and evenly measured, and Marin sat at the other end of the stone bench, wearing a thin sweater, her hands clasped together on her lap. She looked up at the stars for a long while, as though searching for the beginning of a very long road, then said in a low, steady voice that she would tell him once, from beginning to end, and that he mustn't interrupt her with questions, because if she stopped halfway through, she wasn't certain she would have the strength to continue. Ronan only nodded. She began at the farthest point, saying that she had lost her family very young, leaving only 2 sisters to depend on each other as they grew up beneath the temporary roofs of strangers. Her younger sister's name was Bess. She was 1 year younger than Marin, and had been born with a weak heart, a congenital condition the doctors said would follow her throughout her life and require a level of medical care 2 orphaned girls could never hope to reach. When Marin was 19, several people in suits came looking for her. They introduced themselves as representatives of a defense scholarship foundation. They said school testing had revealed that she possessed certain rare abilities. They promised her a special training program, a future, and most important of all, lifelong medical treatment for Bess at a leading cardiac center. Marin signed the papers so quickly that even years later she still wondered whether she had finished reading the first page, and the gate that closed behind her led into a place that appeared on no map. They called it by a code name, Halcyon. She described the years that followed in short, precise sentences, like bullets being removed one by one from a magazine, rooms without a single window, where day and night were merely 2 different settings of the lights, instructors who spoke of compassion as though it were a defect that needed to be cut away, training that emptied a person out and then forged what remained into something else. Then came the assignments, journeys to places that didn't officially exist, names that had to be forgotten the moment a mission ended. I did things the law has no name for, and the conscience has nowhere to store, she said. But there was one line I never crossed, a line I defended at any cost, even though they punished me for it again and again. I never took a life while even one other path remained. Her voice slowed when she returned to Bess. You have to understand this, she said. During all those years, they never needed to lock my door. They never needed guards. They didn't have to chain my feet. They chained me with my sister's heartbeat. Every injection Bess received, every examination, every pill she swallowed each day came from the program's budget, and both sides understood the unspoken rule. I obeyed, and her heart kept beating. It was that simple. But during the 4th year, the assignments began crossing the boundary I had sworn never to cross, and I began saying no. The first time, then the second. I believed the price would fall upon me, and I had prepared myself for that, but they were more intelligent than that. They didn't touch me. One day, the cardiac center announced that Bess's treatment plan had to be temporarily suspended for reassessment. That was all. A few words on a sheet of paper, a warning written in a language only I could read. They calculated that I would fall to my knees within weeks, and I did. Do you know that, Ronan? I agreed to everything after only 4 days. But Bess's heart couldn't wait for their machinery of paperwork to begin turning again. The complication came on a November night, and she was gone before dawn. She had just turned 21. Her file was closed with 4 words: complications from a medical condition. Marin paused for a moment, and when she continued, her voice didn't break. It became empty in a way that hurt more than crying. I call it something else. The bill for my disobedience. After the funeral, with no music and no flowers, the chain was broken. She told the rest as though she were speaking about a third person. Someone with nothing left to lose was someone they could no longer control. I left that same night. I used everything they had taught me to erase myself from every database, every file, every photograph, every fingerprint, and the woman who appeared in Boston 5 years ago, carrying 1 suitcase, brought only one thing from her former life, a yarn bracelet woven long ago by a pair of fragile hands as a gift for an older sister. You asked why I chose to become a maid. She lifted one corner of her mouth, though the smile never reached her eyes, because I chose a job where no one looks into your eyes. People look at the mistress of the house. They look at the guests. No one looks at the woman cleaning the floor, and an invisible person isn't hunted. As for why I agreed to marry you, I had already refused your money once, but when I stood outside your study that day, I could think of only one thing. I couldn't save my sister, so I chose to save 30 children who needed a home. It was the finest bargain of my life, even though the price was stepping into the light. She turned to look at him for the first time during the entire story, and this was when her voice truly cracked. And the reason I remained silent with you for so long wasn't the contract, and it wasn't because I didn't trust you. It was because I was afraid. Ronan. I was more afraid of this moment than I am of any hunter waiting outside. I was afraid that once you knew what I had been, you would see a weapon instead of a wife. The garden remained silent for a long time after those words, with only the wind moving through the mint beds. Then Ronan did something he had never done throughout their marriage on paper. He moved closer, took her tightly clasped hands, gently pulled them apart, and held them inside his own. Then he spoke in a low voice none of the men under his command had ever heard. Listen to me. I married you because you were the only person in this city who wanted nothing from me. Now I understand that you were also the only person who never needed me to protect you. So let me do the one thing you have never allowed anyone else to do. Let me stand beside you. Maren looked at the man before her, searching his eyes for the gaze someone would give a weapon, and she found no trace of it. She saw only something she had stopped hoping for 8 years earlier, and when he lowered his face toward hers, she didn't pull away. The kiss they shared beneath the stars in the herb garden that night was slow and gentle, carrying the salt of a tear neither of them knew belonged to whom, and it was the first kiss between those two people that existed outside every contract they had ever signed. They remained together in the herb garden for a long while after that kiss, and Maren believed there was nothing left that night capable of making her lose her balance. She had laid down the burden of 8 years and exposed the final darkness of her life. But she didn't know that the man holding her hand had also brought a secret into the garden, and that he had waited throughout her story to decide whether he should place it before her. Ronan remained silent for a long time, then quietly said that it was his turn now. There was something she needed to see, something he had kept for weeks without understanding it until tonight. He rose, led her through the dark corridors of the east wing and down to the study, then stopped before the wood-paneled wall behind his desk, where old Cormac's private safe was hidden. A safe that, according to his final wishes, only the heir was permitted to open. Ronan entered the combination, the heavy steel door released, and from the deepest compartment, beneath land deeds and an antique pistol that had been emptied of ammunition, he withdrew a large yellowed envelope, sealed with red wax. Across the front was a single handwritten line in the trembling script of a sick man. For Ronan, open only when you understand whom you married. He explained that he had found it 3 days after the funeral while inspecting the safe as part of the inheritance procedures, and for weeks he had believed it was merely one of the final riddles of an old man who enjoyed controlling people even from inside his grave. He had intended never to open it. Then the recording began to spread. Then the photograph of the 6 recruits dressed in gray appeared, and 1 week earlier, while sitting alone in this study, he had broken the red wax seal. He handed her the envelope and told her to look for herself. Maren accepted it with both hands, and the moment she pulled the documents from inside beneath the light of the desk lamp, her entire body became rigid as stone, because the first thing resting on top was a black and white photograph of a very young woman dressed in gray, her face severe, her eyes empty, standing before a white wall without windows. A photograph Maren knew with absolute certainty could have existed in only one kind of file anywhere in the world. Beneath it were pages whose every trace she had believed she had burned from the face of the earth. Performance evaluations filled with numbers she still knew by heart, the codename Thimble printed in red ink, reports from the tests, even a page of notes concerning her principle of refusing to take a life, accompanied by an instructor's assessment. Everything was there. Her entire halcyon file was resting inside the safe of an old Boston crime lord who had died nearly half a year earlier. She turned to the final page, where a separate handwritten note had been attached, its lines crooked and trembling beneath a hand almost drained of strength, though every stroke still carried the will of the man who had written it. When the war comes, and it will come, the boy will need someone money cannot buy. I have found her for him. Maren read the words 3 times, and every fragment of the past 5 years began falling into place, forming a shape that left her unable to breathe. She remembered the day she had applied for work at the mansion, an employment notice printed in a local newspaper that she had always believed she had discovered by chance. She remembered how quickly the personnel manager had hired her, even though she had only 3 years of experience cleaning hotel rooms. She remembered the times old Cormac had sat in his wheelchair on the porch and watched her work in the garden for long stretches without saying a word. And with a chill running along her spine, she understood that none of it had been accidental. The old man, using the intelligence network he had cultivated over half a century and the debts of honor scattered throughout agencies without names, had traced her 2 years earlier. He had seen through the 5 years of hiding she had believed were flawless. He had quietly arranged for her to walk through the Crown Point gates, as though the choice had been entirely her own. Then came the final move. The strange provision in his will requiring the heir to marry hadn't been the stubbornness of an old-fashioned man. It had been written for one precise purpose: to push two specific people onto the same marriage certificate. The words he had spoken beside the sickbed on their wedding day exploded through her memory. This girl has the eyes of someone who has walked through fire. He hadn't been confused. He had been the only person in the chapel that day who knew exactly what he was saying, who knew who she was and where she had come from, and still took her hand in those trembling fingers. The shock was divided equally between the two people standing beside the open safe. Maren was stunned because the 5 years she had spent invisible had apparently been no more than clear glass before one old man's eyes. Ronan, watching his wife turn through the pages of her file, finally absorbed the remaining meaning, that his entire rebellion against the provision in the will, even the moment when he had believed himself clever for choosing a harmless maid to outmaneuver the families, had all been anticipated. He had never made a move that was truly his own. He had merely stepped across the squares his grandfather had already drawn for him. The realization made him want to strike the desk and laugh at the same time, and he did both, releasing a dry, brief laugh of helplessness before an old man who had defeated them both from beyond the grave. They stood silently beside each other in the study for a long while, with the file and the handwritten note resting on the desk between them. At last, Maren spoke first, her voice still dazed, saying that he had deceived them both. Ronan looked at his grandfather's trembling handwriting for a long time, then slowly shook his head. "No," he said. "He didn't deceive us. He wagered on us. He wagered that if he pushed a man who had never trusted anyone, and a woman who had never dared allow anyone to stand beside her beneath the same roof, they would eventually find each other on their own. And look at us. He won." Maren looked at him, then at the photograph of the young woman in gray lying on the desk. The young woman, an old stranger, had seen not as a lost weapon, but as someone worthy of being entrusted to his only grandson, and something inside her chest, something that had remained frozen since a November night 8 years earlier, began to crack in a way that felt strangely gentle. From that night forward, between the two people inside the Crown Point mansion, the word together no longer belonged to any document bearing signatures and seals. It became a choice, made again every day, and because of that, no power waiting outside could ever cancel it again. The morning after the night beside the safe, the Crown Point mansion awakened to a new order. No longer were they a crime lord and a wife on paper, living at opposite ends of the same house. They were an alliance, and that alliance decided it was time to stop absorbing blows and begin striking back. Maren established the first principle with the precision of a combat order. The hidden enemy was powerful because he stood in darkness while they stood beneath the light, so their first move wasn't to throw a punch, but to drag him into the open, and to do that, they had to follow the one thing that never knew how to lie: the flow of money. The operation moved forward along 3 parallel tracks. The first belonged to Maren, who for the first time in 8 years deliberately dialed numbers she had sworn she would never touch again. Every call became a negotiation stretched as tight as wire between old debts and new danger. An anonymous financial specialist overseas, a man she had once pulled out of a disastrous operation, fell silent for 10 seconds when he heard her voice, then asked only one question. "Do you understand that calling me means you've just marked your own position?" She answered that she did, and that was why he should understand how important this was. Another person refused her outright, then called back after midnight from a different number, his voice heavy, as he said to consider this the final payment on the debt from Lisbon, and after this, never contact me again. Piece by piece, information returned to her in that manner, each fragment accompanied by a farewell meant to last forever. The second track belonged to Noelle, who returned to the mansion only 1 day after disappearing, carrying a suitcase filled with equipment and declaring that if the bell had already rung, then she would rather stand beside the only person in the world who had once pulled her out of a collapsed basement. Noelle's hands unlocked encrypted financial databases that even federal agencies would have needed years of court orders to reach, tracing each intermediary account and every shell company layered inside another like wooden dolls. The third track belonged to Donnelly and the oldest methods of all: paper, ink, and 40 years of memory. He compared shipping manifests, minutes from harbor meetings, and handwritten records kept by retired warehouse guards, scraps of information that appeared meaningless until they were placed against Noelle's digital map, where each fragment fit with a precision that made the entire picture terrifying. After 6 days and nights with almost no sleep, The full design emerged across the long table in the study, and it was larger and colder than anything they had imagined. Sterling Voss had begun making this move more than a year earlier, long before old Cormac died. Shell companies had been created in advance and left dormant like buried mines. Unusually favorable loans had been fed in small amounts to struggling families, slowly turning their creditor into their commander. When the provision in the Gallagher will became known, Voss had only needed to place a fuse into the mine already waiting beneath the ground. The attempt to force a signature onto the separation papers, the campaign of newspaper smears, the freezing of the shelter's funds, none of them had been intended as a final blow. They were bait, matches struck one after another around a storehouse filled with gunpowder, because his true objective had never been a signature or a maid. His real purpose was to push the East Coast families into a civil war built on mutual suspicion, to turn the guns of one family against another, to shatter old alliances, and when the smoke cleared, the only man still whole, still wealthy, and still clean would be the banker who had remained outside every exchange of gunfire, ready to lend each side the money to rebuild at the interest rate of a man with no competition. Ronan looked at the map covered in tangled red arrows and spoke the thought filling the entire room. He doesn't need to win the war. He only needs everyone else to lose. Then they discovered the trap already preparing to close. Hidden inside a chain of encrypted messages Noel had extracted from an intermediary server. 2 nights later, a peace conference would be called at an abandoned cold storage warehouse in the South Boston Harbor District. Officially, so Voss could mediate the growing tension between the Gallagher family and 3 neutral families before the confirmation hearing, presenting himself as a benevolent outsider. But the shipping manifest Donnelly had uncovered told a different story. On that same night, an undeclared shipment would arrive less than 500 meters from the warehouse. The container was listed as carrying industrial refrigeration equipment, but its weight and port of origin matched a shipment of weapons large enough to equip a small army, weapons that would already be within reach of whichever side Voss had chosen, waiting only for an excuse inside the conference to fire the first shot of the Civil War. On the 6th night, when everyone was exhausted and Ronan and Noel were arguing over the layout of the cold storage warehouse, Marin sat alone at one corner of the table with the oldest set of financial records, yellowed banking documents from the early days of Voss's system, that an old contact had used to repay a debt by sending her an entire crate of hastily scanned files. She turned each page with the relentless attention to detail trained into her by her former profession, and then, on one page, her fingers stopped. The paper showed a sequence of transactions stamped as highly classified, belonging to an unnamed client identified only by a numerical code. But she recognized the structure of the accounts immediately, the way a person recognizes the handwriting of someone who wrote the shape of their life. During those years, Sterling Voss's bank had been one of the channels used to launder the money that kept Halcyon operating. Payments for facilities without addresses and medical contracts without hospitals had all passed through his hands before becoming invisible. Then, near the end of the file, she found an approval order that seemed to stop the blood inside her body. A few dry, typed lines authorized an adjustment to external medical expenses, a temporary reduction pending reassessment. The date in the corner matched with merciless precision the November she had never forgotten, and beneath it, on the line confirming the transaction through an intermediary, was a hastily written name that remained perfectly legible: Mercer. She sat motionless before the document without knowing how long she had been there. The voices of the 2 people arguing nearby faded until they seemed to come from another room. For 8 years, she had lived with the belief that the force responsible for her sister's death had been a faceless machine, a system she could hate but could never touch. Yet tonight, that machine had revealed a specific hand and a specific signature, and that hand belonged to the man standing directly behind the enemy before her, less than an hour's drive from Crown Point Hill. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Ronan woke and saw the door across the corridor standing open. He found his wife in the herb garden, sitting on the stone bench in cold sharp enough to cut the skin, wearing no coat, her eyes open and fixed upon the darkness, the yellowed document still held in her hand. He asked nothing. He only removed his coat, placed it around her shoulders, and sat beside her. And in the silence of that garden, for the first time in 8 years, the principle she had preserved through every test, every humiliation inflicted by her instructors, and every one of the darkest assignments, the final boundary that made her who she was, had truly begun to waver. The following morning, with only 1 day remaining before the conference at the cold storage warehouse, the final piece of the internal puzzle fell precisely into place. Noel traced the path of the transfer document bearing Josie Alvarez's name and discovered that it had been created through an intermediary account that existed for exactly 72 hours before destroying itself, a sophisticated method of fabrication with only one flaw. The person who created the order had accessed the system through a network address that had been used 3 times before, and on all 3 occasions, the access matched the hours when a personal device connected to the mansion's internal network, a device registered under the name of Security Captain Fitch. Donnelly placed the completed stack of records on the study table, as though laying down a sentence: the duty schedule with its unexplained gaps on the night of the intrusion, the entry into the server room outside his assigned shift, the regular cash payments used to settle debts at an underground casino, whose ownership led back to Sterling Voss after only 2 layers were removed, and now the technical trace connected to the very document that had nearly cost Marin her only friend. Everything closed into a circle around one name: Fitch, the debtor who had sold the keys to the mansion to erase his gambling losses, the man who had disabled 3 cameras in the West Wing, leaked the 59-second recording, and fabricated evidence against Josie so that suspicion would turn inward and tear the household apart from within. Ronan's first reaction was the instinct that had run through Gallagher blood for 4 generations: summon him, and let the rest happen behind a closed door. But Marin placed one hand on the file, shook her head, and spoke with the voice of someone who had already seen 3 moves ahead. Don't cut down an antenna that is still transmitting. Right now, Fitch is the only line running directly from inside our house to Voss's ear. Arrest him, and Voss becomes deaf. And an enemy who suddenly goes deaf before the hour of action becomes an enemy on his guard. Leave him where he is, and from this moment onward, everything he hears will be written by us. And so the traitor, without the slightest awareness of it, was promoted into a musician playing a score composed by someone else. Conversations were arranged to fall within his hearing. False orders were given, saying the Gallagher family would send only 2 lieutenants to the conference as a gesture of submission. Complaints were carefully performed about Mrs. Gallagher remaining at the mansion for her own safety. Every piece of bait was cut with precision, and Fitch's reports flowed steadily back to the Western estate, carrying exactly the picture Marin wanted Sterling Voss to see. But before they went to war, there was another debt that had to be paid, one recorded in no file. That afternoon, Marin drove to the red brick building and found Josie in the shelter kitchen, amid the smell of cookies baking for the children's afternoon snack. She led her friend out onto the quiet back porch, placed the decoded false transfer document in Josie's hands, along with the full truth, and spoke without evasion. For one day, one entire day, I held this paper and doubted you. I allowed the coldest part of me to place you on a list of suspects, and I am sorry, not because I eventually discovered the truth, but because I allowed the enemy to teach me how to look at you. Josie listened to everything, looked down at the document, then back at her friend, and instead of becoming angry, she took Marin's hand and held it tightly. You know, she said, when I discovered my former husband was lying to me, I doubted the whole world for half a year. That is what people do. The knife of a cruel person always aims at the place where we trust the most. So defeat them. Defeat them so completely it hurts, and let me teach you how to look at me again. Then she smiled, pressed a warm cookie into Marin's hand, and the friendship between the 2 women, after a fracture that had almost become a break, grew another layer stronger in the way only a true friendship can. On the final night before the conference, husband and wife stood inside the steel room beneath the mansion, where 4 generations of Gallaghers had stored the tools of the underworld. Ronan inspected every gun belonging to the escort team, while Marin chose only the things no one would expect. Several lengths of cord, a roll of cloth tape, ordinary objects that became more valuable than any firearm in her hands. Among those cold steel shelves, she stopped, turned toward her husband, and spoke the words she had repeated to herself ever since that night at 3 o'clock in the garden. Listen to me, and hear all of it. Tomorrow, inside that warehouse, there will be a man whose signature lies beneath my sister's death. For 8 years, I hated a machine. Now that machine has a face, and I don't know who I will become when I stand before it. So I need to tell you this now as a promise. Tomorrow, I won't take anyone's life unless there is no other path left, including his, especially his, because if I cross that line for revenge, then I won't be the one who wins. The instructors from all those years ago will win. The ones who always said my compassion was only a weakness that hadn't yet been broken. I need you to accept that before we go. And tomorrow, if I falter, if you see my hand remain still for longer than a breath, remind me who I am." Ronan placed the gun he had been examining onto the steel rack and walked over to stand before his wife. The man who had never spoken the word trust to anyone outside his own blood looked directly into her ash-gray eyes and said slowly and clearly, "I trust you more than I have ever trusted anyone in my life, and tomorrow, if you falter, I won't need to remind you with words. I only need to stand beside you, because you have never forgotten who you are. You only need someone who can see it with you." The rest of the night passed through encrypted messages traveling from the mansion to each trusted lieutenant. The cold storage warehouse was divided into numbered zones. Every change of position was assigned down to the placement of each footstep. The signal to act would be the sound of the truck engine carrying the container marked as industrial refrigeration equipment. Every piece of the reverse trap was set into place as quietly as breathing, while at the Western estate, Sterling Voss read Fitch's final report and smiled with satisfaction at a Gallagher family lowering its head exactly as he had calculated, never realizing that the board he believed he was arranging was the very board already prepared for him to sit down and play. The abandoned cold storage warehouse in South Boston rose out of the night like an enormous steel box forgotten by time, and at exactly 9 o'clock, Sterling Voss's performance began beneath rows of industrial lights that had been brought back to life through temporary wiring. In the center of the warehouse stood a long table covered with a white cloth that looked strangely out of place. Around it sat representatives from 3 neutral families and 2 Gallagher lieutenants, arriving exactly as Fitch's report had promised. There was no crime lord, no woman from the recording, only 2 subordinates lowering their heads in apparent submission, while Voss stood at the head of the table in a silver-gray suit, opening his arms like a benevolent father, and beginning his speech of reconciliation in the velvet voice that had purchased half the East Coast. He spoke of the unfortunate misunderstandings of recent weeks, of a Boston that needed stability before the confirmation hearing, and then, sentence by sentence, he began sewing needles into the cloth. Naturally, all of you have seen the recording. How can any of us sleep peacefully when we don't know what the woman standing beside the Gallagher family truly is? I would never presume to draw a conclusion. I merely ask questions. The family representatives began glancing at one another, and hands unconsciously began moving away from the table. The exact poison of suspicion he had spent a year preparing was seeping into the air. Then the signal came. Outside the rear entrance of the warehouse district, the heavy engine of the truck carrying the container marked as industrial refrigeration equipment roared to life, and at the precise moment Voss had planned for his trap to close. As the guards scattered throughout the warehouse under the pretense of protecting the conference began shifting toward their assigned positions, the trap truly did close, but in the opposite direction. The 2 Gallagher lieutenants, who had memorized the numbered layout down to every footstep the night before, left their chairs in one clean, simultaneous movement and withdrew behind 2 steel columns, positioned inside the blind spots of every weapon in the warehouse. The family representatives instinctively moved away from the table, and Voss's guards suddenly realized that the formation on the floor no longer resembled any plan they had been given. The positions that should have controlled the entire room now controlled nothing but an empty table. Voss stood inside the circle of light, and for the first time that night, the velvet smile hardened on his face, because his calculating mind needed only 2 seconds to complete the equation. This formation couldn't have been improvised. It had been prepared in advance. Every report he had received throughout the week had been information placed deliberately before him. His antenna inside the mansion had been discovered long ago and turned against him. His eyes swept across the warehouse and stopped at the far corner, where Fitch stood among the attendants, his face growing whiter by the second, and Sterling Voss did what men of his kind always did when their ship began to sink. He threw someone else into the water first. He pointed directly at Fitch, and raised his voice so every family could hear. "Gentlemen, it appears we have a double agent among us. This man approached me and tried to sell information about his own employer. I refused, but apparently he has been selling to more than one buyer. It was a shameless sacrifice intended to sever the trail and turn suspicion elsewhere. But Voss had miscalculated one thing. The man he sacrificed had nothing left to lose. Fitch was trapped both literally and figuratively. He looked around, saw every exit closed, and broke apart like a dam. Before representatives of all 3 families, he screamed that Voss had hired him, that Voss had erased his gambling debts in exchange for disabling the cameras that night, leaking the recording, and fabricating the transfer document to frame someone else. It was all him. Even the shipment outside the rear entrance belonged to him. In the moment, the warehouse fell silent beneath that confession. As every eye turned toward the banker, a shadow dropped without a sound from the darkness above, where rusted maintenance scaffolding stretched beneath the roof. Marin landed among the guards as they panicked and reached for their weapons, and what followed would later be described by the family representatives in the voice of people recalling a force of nature rather than a fight. She moved through the crowd like water slipping between stones. The first gun was stripped from its owner's hand before he could fully raise it, dismantled, and sent spinning in 2 directions. The second man had his arm locked and was lowered to the floor so smoothly that the sound of his back touching the concrete was louder than his cry. The thin cord in her hand wrapped around the third man's wrist and pulled his entire body off course into a steel column. One by one, in an order she had calculated from the scaffolding above, they were disabled and left on the warehouse floor. No lives were taken. No blood marked the ground. There were only ragged breaths and wide eyes, unable to understand what had just swept through their lives. When the last man stopped moving, the only sound remaining in the cold warehouse was the low hum of the generator feeding the lights. Then, slow applause came from the side entrance. Mercer stepped out of the darkness, removed his coat, folded it carefully, and placed it on a wooden crate, and the fragment Dr. Everett Lang had left unfinished on the porch of his main home fell into place before everyone watching. This was the trainee Lang had personally removed from the program because he had been too willing to kill. The man who had ranked first in every test except one, the man condemned forever to second place behind a single name, Thimble, the man who had recognized her after only 3 seconds of footage and had waited 8 years for this moment. As the two of them began circling each other, he spoke in the same flat voice, without rise or fall. They told me I lacked something you possessed. They erased my name because of it. 8 years later, I still don't know what it was. The duel began without warning. These were no common guards. Mercer fought in the exact discipline that had created them both, using short, direct, economical strikes aimed at joints and points of balance. For the first time since the kitchen, Marin had to retreat, had to block, had to pay for every moment of exposure, with impacts that stole her balance for a fraction of a second. The two figures locked together in the center of the warehouse like blades forged in the same fire. But there was one thing 8 years of cleaning floors hadn't taken from her, while 8 years of feeding hatred had taken it from him. Stillness. Mercer fought to prove something to the people who had erased his name. Marin fought only to end the confrontation, and that hunger to prove himself caused him to overextend by half the width of a hand. Half the width of a hand was everything she needed. She turned inside the strike, borrowed its force, locked his shoulder, swept away his balance, and Mercer hit the cold warehouse floor with one arm twisted behind his back. Her other hand rested precisely against the point on his neck, where every lesson they had once learned said a single decisive press would be enough. The warehouse stopped breathing, because everyone who had seen the recording knew this woman had spared all 4 men who invaded her home, but no one standing there that night knew that beneath her hand lay the signature written under her sister's death. 1 beat passed. Her hand didn't rise. 2 beats. Her fingers trembled slightly. At the edge of the light, Ronan didn't call out a reminder, as she had asked him to do. He simply stepped forward once, far enough for her to see him standing there, and that was enough. Marin lowered her face close to the defeated man's ear, and spoke so quietly that only he could hear. "This is it." Then she released him, rose to her feet, and stepped back, leaving Mercer alive with the answer he had spent 8 years trying to find. Behind the rows of wooden crates, Sterling Voss was moving carefully toward an emergency exit when a tall figure separated from the darkness and blocked the iron door. Ronan Gallagher stood there without drawing a weapon. He simply stood in Voss's path, and when the banker retreated, stammering about order, about a decaying system that needed a firm hand to arrange it again, about things a younger man couldn't understand, Ronan interrupted in a voice as cold as the warehouse floor beneath them. "I understand enough, Voss. You wanted to set fire to everyone else, watch them burn one another, then sell them the water to put it out. That isn't order, Voss. That is chaos wearing a 3-piece suit." The night at the cold storage warehouse ended not with gunfire, but with paperwork, and that was exactly how Marin wanted it to end. In the hours that followed, before the family representatives had fully recovered from the shock, and while Voss's guards were still lying in rows waiting to be removed, she sat before 2 computers in the mansion study, with the entire collection of evidence gathered during 6 sleepless days and nights spread before her. The shell companies, the loans used to bind the families, the shipping manifest for the weapons shipment, Fitch's fully recorded confession, and the documents tracing 20 years of money laundering through that bank of shadows. But before the file could be allowed to leave the mansion, it had to pass through her hands one final time, because among the tangled lines were threads that touched the Gallagher family, old transactions from Cormac's time, the names of lieutenants, and routes that would lead trouble back to Crown Point Hill if any investigator followed them. And so, throughout one sleepless night, Marin did to the evidence what she had once been trained to do to living human beings. She severed every connected path, erased every trace, and redirected every current of proof until every road in the file led to one name, and one name alone, Sterling Voss. As Ronan stood behind her watching lines of data disappear and rearrange themselves beneath his wife's hands like a magician's illusion, she said lightly that she had once learned how to erase a human being from the records, and removing a name from a file was much easier. The purified file left Boston through Noel's channels and reached a federal agent, whose name people from the old world still spoke with caution, a man whom a Halcyon operative had once pulled out of a failed mission that should have taken his life, a debt that had gone unmentioned through all the years since. When Noel placed the envelope on his desk and said only that the debt had come due, he opened it, read for 10 minutes, and picked up the telephone. What followed happened so quickly and cleanly that the newspapers couldn't keep pace. Before dawn on the third day, federal teams moved simultaneously on the South Boston cold storage warehouse, where the container shipment still sat untouched, on the Western Estate, and on 3 law offices holding the shell companies in name only. Sterling Voss was handcuffed in the middle of his own study, surrounded by the filing cabinets he had believed untouchable. The photograph of the silver-haired banker lowering his head as he passed through a barricade of reporters became the front-page image of every newspaper along the East Coast. The empire he had spent 20 years building collapsed in a chain reaction, exactly as he had once intended for others. Debtor families competed to cooperate with investigators in hopes of saving themselves. Layer after layer of false ownership was stripped away and turned into page after page of indictments. Mercer, separated under a different chain of evidence that included the approval order bearing his signature from years earlier, was extradited one quiet morning without spectacle, and people later said that throughout the transfer, he didn't speak a single word. Only once, when an investigator asked whether he wished to make a statement about the woman in the warehouse, did he remain silent for a long time before answering with one sentence. "You will never find her." Then he refused to say anything more. The storm withdrew and left a clear sky behind it. Sparrow House was fully exonerated within a week. The final inspection report confirmed that every source of funding was legitimate and that the complaint had been fabricated. The donation account was reopened, accompanied by an unprecedented flood of support from people who had read the news. The newspaper that had published the smear was forced to print a public correction in the exact front-page position where the original headline had appeared, and the suppliers who had once quietly canceled their contracts began calling to ask whether they could resume doing business, offering the same evasive explanations as before, though this time Josie only laughed after listening. The inheritance confirmation hearing took place soon afterward in the great hall of the family council, and it was shorter than anyone had expected, because the powerful people seated around that long table had now seen with their own eyes who had spent the previous year controlling every thread of the chaos, who had lent them money in order to lead them by the nose, and who had dragged the truth into the light without spilling a single drop of blood from any family. Ronan Gallagher's inheritance was confirmed without a single opposing vote. Yet the moment people spoke of most afterward wasn't the vote. It was the moment the doors of the great hall opened, and the woman once called a maid by the entire underworld, once called a breathing signature by her own husband, entered as Mrs. Gallagher, her back straight and her footsteps quiet, and the entire room, silver-haired elders and crime lords who had once regarded her as a lesser piece on the board, rose one by one to their feet. A few days later, Donnelly reported to his young master about the changes within the organization in his usual composed voice, though the corners of his eyes concealed a smile. "At first, sir, it was unease. Our people didn't know how to behave around a mistress like her. Now it is respect, perhaps even more than they have for you, if I may speak honestly. She brought down all those men without taking a single life. Those of us who live by this profession understand that doing so is 100 times more difficult than pulling a trigger. As for Marin, she devoted the most beautiful afternoon of that autumn to the red brick building. The Sparrow House courtyard rang with laughter that day, because the children had just completed a new mural they had painted together. Tiny hands stained with color pulled her from one corner of the wall to another, eager to show her every detail. In the middle of that afternoon, she knelt before the youngest girl in the home, opened the child's hand, and placed inside it the faded yarn bracelet she had carried for 8 years. "This was the lucky bracelet of the bravest person I ever loved," she told her. "Now I am giving it to you, so it can protect you while you grow strong and healthy." The little girl stared with wide eyes, slipped the bracelet onto her wrist immediately, admired it for 1 second, then ran across the courtyard to show everyone, her bright laughter trailing behind her. Marin stood watching as the last keepsake of her former life became part of a childhood growing beneath the afternoon sun, and she felt a stone she had carried inside her chest for 8 years finally become lighter. Beyond the gates, Ronan waited beside the car without rushing her, only watching. That evening, in the mansion study, he took the thick marriage agreement they had signed before the wedding from a drawer and placed it on the desk between them. Then, beneath her gaze, he lifted the stack of papers and tore it cleanly in half with one decisive motion. "The confirmation hearing is over," he said. "This paper has served its purpose. I don't want to renew it. I want to begin again. And this time, there will be no signatures between us." 3 months later, the great hall of the Crown Point mansion glowed with light on a night unlike anything the Hill had witnessed through 4 generations of the Gallagher family, the first gala of the Sparrow Foundation, and the woman standing at the entrance to welcome every guest was none other than the one who, 2 years earlier, had knelt on this very marble floor to wipe away every mark of water. Tonight, Marin Gallagher stood there in a deep blue evening gown, her chestnut brown hair falling freely instead of being gathered into the low knot she had once worn at the back of her neck, smiling as she greeted each guest by name. And no one crossed that threshold without recognizing the beautiful irony of fate, that the place where she had once bent down to clean the floor was now the place where she stood tall to welcome the entire city. The evening opened with a performance no professional artist could have surpassed. The 30 children of Sparrow House, dressed in white uniforms, stood in rows upon a wooden platform and raised their voices together in a song about little sparrows finding a home. Their tiny faces were serious in the most endearing way, and their uncertain high notes made the entire hall laugh before falling silent again. When the song ended, the youngest girl in the front row lifted the wrist wearing the faded yarn bracelet and waved toward Marin. The whole hall rose in applause that lasted so long the children had to bow 3 times before they were finally allowed to leave the stage. It was applause from some of the most powerful people on the East Coast, offered to those children, yet their eyes remained fixed upon the woman wiping the corner of one eye beside her husband. Throughout the evening, guests approached one after another to shake the hand of their hostess, elders who had voted at the confirmation hearing, business leaders who had followed the story in the newspapers, and even figures from the underworld hidden beneath the polished appearance of high society. They all knew who she was, the woman from the 42nd recording, the legend the entire East Coast had watched again and again. Yet strangely, not one of them approached her with fear. They came with admiration, because the city had learned something from all that had happened, that this woman possessed more than enough power to destroy, yet had used every part of that power to protect, and strength capable of restraining itself deserved greater respect than any strength displayed for the sake of pride. As the evening settled into the gentle rhythm of quiet conversations over glasses of wine, Marin and Ronan slipped onto the balcony and looked down at the lights of the city shining below the hill. The night wind carried the first cold breath of winter, and he placed his coat over her shoulders as he had done at 3 o'clock that morning in the herb garden. After a comfortable silence, he asked the question he had carried inside him for a long time, whether she ever missed her old life. Marin watched the distant lights for a while, then answered with the honesty she had promised she would always give him. "Sometimes," she said, "but not the fighting, and not the violence." What she missed was the clarity. In the old days, every assignment had a target, a boundary, and an ending. Life was far more complicated than that. But do you know something? What we are building here means more than every mission I ever completed. Because back then, all I did was stop people from falling, while now, I am giving them a place where they can grow. Perhaps that is what I was born to do. I simply had to travel a very long road before I found it. Ronan didn't answer. He only took her hand where it rested on the stone railing, the same hand that had once stripped away guns and knives, and the same hand that had placed a yarn bracelet into the palm of a child. The two of them stood there for a long time, while behind them, beyond the glass doors, the golden light of the great hall remained warm as a promise. In the years that followed, the story of the rainy night at Crown Point became a legend told again and again throughout the East Coast underworld. People said that 4 men had entered a mansion to seize a harmless maid, and that single act had ignited a chain of events that destroyed the man who had sent them, brought down a banking empire of shadows that had survived for 20 years, and changed the balance of power across the entire region. They spoke of the 40 seconds inside the kitchen with the reverence reserved for something beyond their understanding. Yet very few people knew the most beautiful part of the story, the part about an old man who made his final move from beyond the grave, an old man who saw a woman walk through fire and still preserve her compassion, and decided that she was the most precious gift he could leave to a grandson who had spent his whole life trusting no one, because some inheritances aren't kept inside safes, docks, or bank accounts. Some are found in choosing the right people to love one another. And perhaps, if this story leaves anything in our hearts, it is 2 simple truths: that the greatest strength within a person isn't the power to destroy, but the freedom to choose not to destroy, even when pain has given us every reason to let go, and that a true family isn't born from contracts or bloodlines. A true family is born when people dare to stand beside one another after the final wall has fallen. Thank you for listening to Marin and Ronan's entire journey all the way to this moment. If this story has touched your heart, please click like, share the video, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the captivating stories we bring to you every day. And what did you think of this story? Which moment moved you the most? Please share your thoughts in the comments so we can hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. Because every message you leave is a flame that inspires us to continue telling stories with even greater meaning. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.